Okay, so I haven't made a video like this in a while, and again, before we get into this video, please subscribe and like this video if you haven't already. I found something very interesting. Okay, so before we made a video kind of talking about how Gen 1's prototype, there was like roughly 237 moves, but 72 of those moves were still missing, and we really didn't have any leads on where to look for some of these moves. Well, believe it or not, there's a couple ways we could approach this, and I think I might have found another solution. I mentioned before how there were some of the Pokemon trading card game cards, the original Wizards of the Coast ones. If you're familiar with the Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color, the first one, not the second one, or maybe the second one too, I'm not. I haven't really played the second one, to be honest, so I can't really say off the top of my head, mostly because it was Japanese only, otherwise I would have by now. But I should because I know Japanese. That's just when I was growing up. That's that story. But anyways, what does this have to do with Pokemon Gen 1 prototype? Well, believe it or not, there were some Pokemon moves that were on some of those cards that could have been in this list. And to make it even more ridiculous, I've already proven before there were some Pokemon attacks that were in the prototype that weren't in Gen 1's type. So they cut it because of cartridge limitations. Like, I'll give you an example. Kadabra learned a move called Super Psy. It was, if you've ever played the trading card game, Kadabra does 50 points of damage every time it uses Super Psy, and it was a psychic attack. Okay, so, but that move was not in the final version of Pokemon Gen 1 and Gen 2. But, if you were to play the prototype of Gen 1, there was an attack called Super Psy, and it had an animation. Kind of interesting. I forget how much damage it did. I don't know if it did more than Psybeam or if it did less than Psychic. I know it was just probably in between. It was one of those kind of cut moves. Here's another one for you, but here's something else that's very interesting. I actually forgot about this. You might remember there's a move called Freeze Dry, which was introduced in Gen 6. Now, what does Freeze Dry do? It's a very useful, and assuming this would have had the same effect in Gen 1, it would have been very useful in Gen 1. Because this would have killed Lance's Beluga and Cryothet, assuming those Pokemon would have been Water Dragon types. This would have even killed Claire's Kingdra, because everybody's always complaining Kingdra's a bastard to kill because there's no Dragon type moves you get at that point. But there were Pokemon that could easily kill Kingdra if you had, you don't have to have super effective moves. I mean, there's other strategies to Pokemon, you know what I mean? So, you easily could have took out Kingdra very easily if you had the right setup. I mean, but anyways, but Freeze Dry was actually introduced in Gen 6. Super Psy, or there was also a Psyshock, the one that would do special attack damage, but it would result in physical damage, physical to the defending Pokemon's physical damage. So it's interesting, using a Psychic type Pokemon to do special attack damage, and then they would take the physical attack, the physical defense of that Pokemon, and then that's the damage it would do. So if you had a Pokemon like I forget exactly if it was Chansey's, how Chansey's like a very good special. I forget if it was physical defense was terrible, but its special attack was very good. That would kill it very easily. But if you were to use something like Super Psy against it, or Psyshock, you take a Pokemon like say like Alakazam's special attack, and then all of a sudden its physical defense is now terrible, So that would be what you'd want to kill it with, aside from like, physical moves like, fighting type, because it's a fighting type. I don't know if they changed it, because I know Blissey and Chansey are like, fairy types now. So I don't know. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if that's, if it's not super effective against fairy types. But I have to double check, because that type advantage always throws me off. But what's really strange, though, is just, it's crazy to think, like, how long they've had these ideas for, is the point I'm getting at. Like, so, Freeze Dry and Psyshock, I do believe. And then I was looking at Gengar also had Curse and Dark Mind. Kind of sounds like Nasty Plot, and this is going based on the trading card game. And it was in English, so I'm trying to think what it would have been called. I know Curse was used in Gen 2. We know that was eventually moved, and then as Gen 3 came out, Curse would be a move that would increase your stats. But if it was used by a Dark type or a Ghost type Pokemon, the Pokemon would take fraction damage. It would take half of its life, and then it would put a curse on a defending Pokemon unless they switch it out, and then all of a sudden now that effect's gone. It's interesting actually. So, but it's interesting to think, like, if that was in Gen 1, what would its effect have been? So like, I think Dark Mind could have been changed to maybe Shadow Ball. It's possible, maybe not. Maybe they just took that and turned it into something else later on. Dark Mind could have been Nasty Plot, but instead of doing damage, it would have just been boost your special attack, which would make sense because Gengar is a, what is Gengar? A ghost and a poison type? Yeah. So that explains why, and it's weird because for the longest time, when I was always playing Pokemon, I always used to think, why is it that Gengar was always weak against Psychic type moves, and then you find out why. It's because it's a poison type, which is kind of funny because, like, even in the storyline, Giovanni was trying, if you believe that theory, Giovanni stole the Silscope so he could get a ghost type so he could fight against, Mewtwo, just in case he had a backup plan. But because of the limitation of ghost type Pokemon, those were weak against Psychic type, so it wouldn't have really worked out the way they did. So they had to come out with Dark type Pokemon, and that was actually interesting too, how they came up with that concept. But Psychic type Pokemon are still overpowered in their own right. I mean, heck, even Mewtwo going toe to toe with an Alakazam would have been very interesting, because as long as Mewtwo wasn't doing physical damage, it probably wouldn't have killed Alakazam. But at the same time, it probably could have, because it's got Swift and Psychic, I believe. So Swift, I don't know if Swift did it do special type moves? No, because it was a normal type, so it did normal type moves, damage in Gen 1. But later on, once Gen 3 came out, then they changed it, like everything, or no, Gen 4, I believe, is when they started having, like, every type could have physical and special type moves. You had physical type dragon moves, you've had special type dragon moves, and you also had dragon types that were special sweepers, and then, this is when they started getting more, this is how it should have been from Gen 1, but due to the complexity of the cartridges and all that, I understand that they could only do so much, so they eventually changed it a little bit more. So, but basically this is what I'm getting at. Right now we're still looking into this, and here's something else to think about. We'll even talk about this a little bit more. There's actually, according to the Helix Chamber, and they're right about this isn't fake, this was actually leaked in the source code, the original programming, but the problem is, though, I don't know where in the source code, so I'm still trying to figure out, like, what is even in there that we're still looking for, if there even is anything we're still looking for in there, but I'm still looking for stuff. So, but basically, according to the source code of Pokemon Blue, which is the original green and red that was never released outside of Japan, it's basically the 1.0 version, and then when Pokemon Japanese Blue came out, that would be the same one that we got. That would be like a later updated version. That's like a 0.1.1 version, 1.1 version of the original Gen 1. So, but here's what happened though. So when Pokemon first came out, obviously there were 165 Pokemon moves and 151 Pokemon. All right, but according to there's a build that goes back to 11/25/1995. Pokemon Green does, or Blue. So what this would basically state, or no, Green in this case, but it's some of the data that wasn't found until years later. I think what happened was Game Freak finished Pokemon Green and Red right around that time in 1995, but it wouldn't be until 3 months later they would release it. Because what happened was, that's when they started realizing that even though and I do believe they have it backed up on their system somewhere, but then they had to spend another 3 months trying to, if I got it right, it was February 27th, 1996 is when they released it. That's what happened. They decided that would be the time when they would release it, but this was when they dubbed everything down and everything because of cartridge limitation, so they had to vote on what they wanted, and that explains why a lot of stuff was missing at the time. Because some of this stuff, believe it or not, imagine if Gen 1 had, like, there was 191 Pokemon, there were 9 badges, there was a boss rush at the end of the game, Mewtwo wasn't in the Cerulean Cave, but that's where Moltres was, so you wouldn't catch it in Victory Road. Like, imagine, like, some of this stuff was in this game. Like, imagine how much different those games would have been just because of more data capacity. It'd be like the reason why, like, Ocarina of Time could have been as different as it was if, like, let's say they had a disc add-on, like the disc drive, if you're familiar with that, for the Nintendo 64. You know, it's crazy to think like how many ideas Nintendo had came up with that they never utilized because whether because it wouldn't work for them or just because of time and non-popularity, you know, the cost of money, you know. So it's like the same thing with cartridge limitations for what happened to Game Freak. That's what happened to Pokemon. But eventually, this is what I found out, though. You know, like going back to Freeze Dry, and Psyshock. Eventually, they did use this stuff later on in the series. Now, I don't know if Psyshock was introduced in Gen 6 or Gen 5 off the top of my head. Somebody's got to tell me that, or I'll go back and look it up. But the idea was that they had the idea from Gen 1, but then it wouldn't be until like later on they'd go back and use it. I think it was Gen 5, maybe Gen 6, because that was when I started realizing it was there. But it's crazy to think though that some of this stuff has been there from the very beginning, and it's just now starting to make sense to us later on that they really did have. You can really see the direction they went in with it. But if they still have it on their servers, maybe somebody has it. But here's the thing: if the Helix Chamber actually has this in their data vault somewhere, they're not saying anything because it's hard to get a hold of these people until they publicize it. Because if you go to their website, they actually keep track of, like, they're trying to figure out reversing the list right now. It's like they say that there's 237 moves, and they're still trying to figure out what those moves are based on the source code. Because there was this thing called it's called a Shinka, like SHINKA, I believe, .SAVA. Yeah, SAV. That's what the save file would have been for the and DAT files. DAT. They were basic. These are basically what they saved the files as back in the day for like Game Boy games. If you play on like a emulator and all that, like you could have like an SAV file for certain virtual VBA emulation, and or maybe SA1 depending on, you know, the emulator you're using. But basically, it's really interesting to think how they do it. Mostly SAV. Save files. So if they have this data out there, I wouldn't be surprised it's out there. But you know, somebody's got to find it. Somebody's got to reverse engineer it. But it's just proof that yeah, Pokemon definitely has gone back quite a ways before its 6-year development history back in 1989 and 1995 that they had worked on it and trying to figure out what they have now. There's no doubt in my mind that all the stuff that they wanted to use would eventually find its way somehow into the later games. But it really does make you wonder how many ideas they never did use. And if they didn't use the ones that they originally did, if they even reused it and gave it a second chance into something else. Like some of the Pokemon that I wonder, like you have like the Mecha Godzilla, the Omega that they called it, would actually be recycled from Blastoise, and then it was replaced by Mew. And then, you know, but it's crazy to think like how many Pokemon and how many other decisions they made that affected this, the cause and effect of the prototype to the final version of these games. And it makes you wonder like what really got scrapped or what even was an idea at that time, you know. I really want to know if somehow we can figure this all out, like all the stuff we didn't know about this series, because it is confusing trying to figure it out. And I'd say the hardest part is just trying to find the data, because if you could find the data, then you know there's definitely something wrong. You could take anybody that, even a casual Pokemon player, and ask them what was in those games versus what wasn't. You know, if you were to play that game, you'd be surprised how easy it would be to tell what was an idea and what wasn't based on just what you've seen in those games. You know, so anytime there's like a data leak of something, it just blows people's minds like how many ideas people have had, how many theories people had, hypotheses people had for all these games as time went on. And so eventually we're still learning, because again, there's no limit to what you can learn, but it's crazy to think like 30 years later and some of the stuff we're still finding, like, you know, what else are we missing here? You know, that's the next question, obviously. I think really what I want to know is what are those other 72 moves aside from freeze. I think now it'd be safe to say it's down to 70, maybe 69, because I'm still trying to figure out what Dark Mine would have been. So you have Curse, Dark Mine, that I know of off the top of my head, and then Psyshock and Dry Freeze. Freeze Dry. Sorry. And maybe Dive Bomb too. Like Dive Bomb was supposed to be Fly, but then at the same time, the more I think about it, there were some Pokemon cards. I do believe there was a couple Pokemon that had Fly, and then Moltres had Dive Bomb. Maybe Dive Bomb was supposed to be like a signature move that Moltres would have had that at that time nobody else was using. So if that's true, then maybe it was a fire-based flying type move, but it would still been a fire type because that's what Moltres was a flying type. Maybe Dive Bomb was then later recycled in a Sky Attack, but I don't think so. Maybe because it's hard to say, you know, 'cause some of these Pokemon moves, I think what happened was they were all individual moves at one point, but then they just got recycled into something else, you know. Maybe that was before they decided what the animations would be. It's hard to say, you know, it really is. But you know, but at the same time, what about all the other ideas they had that they never, that there's no proof that existed that they probably had, you know? So again, like I said, I'm gonna make a video kind of talking about, like, theoretically, I'm gonna kind of go down the list of the Pokemon moves that were in the trading card game that weren't in the game, and we'll try to figure out which ones might have also have worked. I think there was another one, like Giga Shock could have been another one. That was what Raichu had. That might have been what Gorochu would have had too. But there was a Pokemon move called like Thunder Jolt that wasn't in the final version of Pokemon. And it was, I think it was before what it wasn't not Thunderbolt, you know, Giovanni. It's possible that it might have been a stronger version of Thundershock, but just before Thunderbolt. Or maybe it was stronger than Thunderbolt, but not as strong as Thunder, if that makes sense. Because there were more moves that were left out. What were their base stats at the time? I can tell you for a fact, I found this one out a while ago if I haven't already mentioned it. Mega Fire was actually recycled into, what was it, Dragon's Breath in Gen 1, Gen 2. The one that Claire gives you as a TM. And this would make sense because the TM that you find in the beta lab, not Lavender Town, but the beta of Victory Road, the Elite Four League that they have that was completely scrapped from the game, from Gen 1's prototype, was Mega Fire. I think it was TM8, but it wasn't the same TM8 you're thinking of in Gen 1 because the moves were a little bit different. Again, 237 moves, but only 198 of them, or not 198. It was like some of them survived, some of them didn't. They're still, because you had the original 72. Some of them we did find out, but there's still a good chunk of them that are missing. Whatever those might have been. I take it back. There are, you know, when I said 72 moves, I meant it's like 40 something now. We basically we found some of them, but we still got to go back and figure out what the other ones are. But if we can just get a list going, because you had the original. Because I'm trying to remember, there was a video I uploaded on YouTube, and I was in the debug mode with Mew fighting a Nidoran, I believe. It was the male one. It was basically showing off what the animations were. And we had, like, close to just a little under 200, but we're still missing, like, a good 40 of them. So, so you had the original 165 plus whatever else was that I was able to get my hands on. So we're still looking into it, but at least we kind of have a number to look for. Now, keep in mind, when Gen 2 was released, there was 251 Pokemon total in the final version, but there were way more Pokemon that were scrapped due to cartridge limitations, and I don't think they could have gone past 256 unless they were like really doing some severe hacking. Like, if you could put it into another separate category, it would have been interesting if they could have done it. I wouldn't be surprised. Coding is hard enough to figure out, but there's more than one way to do it, obviously. Same thing with programming and coding. But put it this way, though. But there were 251 moves in Gen 1, Gen 2. And I think some of the stuff that wasn't in Gen 1 could have been in Gen 2. I'll give you another example. Spark. Spark was another good example because that move was not in Gen 1, but it was in Gen 2. Raikou learned it. I believe Lantern could learn it. Chinchou could have learned it. But this is just to kind of give some examples. Of course, we're going to still talk about it in a future video, but right now, this is just to kind of give you more ideas that, you know, this series isn't dead. We're still looking into it, and I think I have another way of, you know, finding some more stuff. So we're going to talk about this. It's going to be probable. We'll hypothesize it and see what we can come across. But I wouldn't be surprised that at least we can prove without a doubt, especially right now, especially with this video, that the ideas that they didn't use before, they did use somehow in the series. So as many Pokemon moves as they are, and I know they like to limit it because, you know, it's becoming a pain in the ass to go back and redo everything by hand. I can understand that. That's what a lot of people kind of get confused with, you know, when you're releasing games is, you know, things are, you know, you can really run into some roadblocks here and there because of, your complexity of like what you're simplifying everything to. So it's interesting to think about. But anyways, like I said before, if you're not subscribed already, please subscribe. Please like this video. And if you want to donate to me, you can, but you don't have to. But I will keep making more videos. As long as I can keep finding stuff that nobody else knows about. Hopefully we can at least kind of solve some of these mysteries. I also forgot to mention, I was digging into Mew's history a little bit more, and I think I found something very disturbing about it. And it's going to be another video of its own, probably the next one I upload. But it's just a heads up, though. So there were people out there that believed that Mew was never originally going to be in Gen 1, but that wasn't entirely true, though. And it wasn't just added at the last second, even though it was. They did have it planned for the Gen 1 Pro. They did have it planned for Gen 1, but they wanted to market it off that there was more than the Pokemon, so the new species would actually make sense in the sense. Because if they didn't have Mew, the Mewtwo story would have been a little bit different. If it wasn't already different because of the Gen 1 prototype, but the diaries were still in Gen 1, so it just kind of played off, like, you know, like when you're playing as Red in Gen 1, you know, you're learning about Mew because you never heard about Mew. You know, but what was Mew, though? Mew was a very rare Pokemon that existed longer than Mewtwo, but because of Mew, you know, that's how the scientists in Cinnabar Island were able to replicate Mewtwo. But because they screwed up the experiment, Mewtwo went vicious, thought they were against, he killed the scientist, blew up Cinnabar Island, and then just went somewhere else. But Giovanni being the survivor, and Dr. Fuji, and Blaine, and even the president of the Silph Co., and heck, you could even say, some of the other characters too. That's what was really going on at the time. You know, they had all these wars that were going on, and maybe even the aftermath of it. But being Pokemon is a world of survival, you know, it really made you think what was going to happen next. So it's something to think about as far as the storyline goes and what we've learned and what we haven't. So it's interesting to think like how many ideas are left out just waiting to be discovered. So Mew was a Pokemon. They could have said Mew was extinct and they found like its fossil remains, but at the same time it was like, if I remember correctly, it was the eyebrow of Mew that they were able to resurrect, and then they created like a Frieza style, or maybe Bira. I'm trying to think, what was that god of destruction from Dragon Ball Z? Because I think that's where they got the concept for it. Was it Lord Beerus? Yeah, Lord Beerus. But I don't know if, you know, I'm trying to think. Like, Lord Beerus was probably created, like, way later on, though. I'm trying to think, though. But I think that's where they got the idea. They might have got the idea, or it was vice versa with Pokemon, or it was they got it from Dragon Ball Z. But I'd have to double check. But as far as back as their characters go, at least. But yeah, they definitely look the same, though. Sort of. But what I was trying to think too, like, you know, but it's interesting to think though, because like, it's scary, because if Mew really didn't exist, then it would have been like, you know, how would they have introduced Mew then? You know, would they have waited until Gen 2, but it was part of Gen 1? You know, because I think what happened was originally they wanted to release it at some point. I mean, because again, Satoshi Tajiri stated that, you know, it was his favorite Pokemon, and he knew about this before Gen 2 even came out. So if this was true, you know, it would have been a joke from the designers that they had their own little secrets because they worked on it. But how would would it have worked the way they initially planned it? Like, Mew would have just been given to you after you've completed the Pokedex, you know? Because they also say that was also what sparked more popularity with Pokemon, was that there was another Pokemon nobody was talking about. The original 150, but then there was a 151. Again, Mew in this case. So it's possible that would have happened, and because of that, that's why Pokemon rocketed to the sales charts. Not just outside of Japan, but in Japan first, and then when it went international, it went even crazier. The Pokemon craze, they called it, back in the 90s and 2000s, and everybody was talking about it. So because of that, that's what happened. That's how Satoshi Tajiri managed to market it, being the way, I mean, you know, the sales department of Pokemon managed to market it the way they did, and everybody knew who he was shortly after. So, but it is interesting to think, like, how Pokemon would have been different if they would have had all this data. Now, some people also have speculated that, you know, it's possible that they might have not made more Pokemon games after Gen 2 or Gen 3, but I don't think that's true. I think they would have still made them anyways. But we're still looking, and but you know, with a long history going on, there's obviously more stuff out there waiting to be discovered. So we just got to figure out what it is and find it. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, but until then, we'll focus on that. But that'll be the next video we make, is talking about more of Mew's origins, and hopefully it will be something that nobody's really seen before.